To kill, to harvest or not to harvest, the moral dilemma that follows you throughout the BioShock experience and defines the fate of the player. This choice lays at the center of your BioShock story and has repercussions that can be felt in nearly every facet of the gameplay. Part of BioShock's lasting legacy, of course, are the little sisters and this moral choice that presented itself to the player. Everyone became a water cooler conversation about, like, well, did you save them? Did you harvest them? That concept, Ken, was that something that came about early in development, or that binary choice? When did that come into the game?
I don't remember when. I mean, we had the concept of them being protected, but I can't remember when you actually
certainly
chose.
wasn't. When there was slugs, it was not meaningful. I think there was.
Do you salt it? Do you not salt it?
Yeah. There were resources that you could get, but there was no choice there, right? The choice was, do I want to fight the Big Daddy or not?
Yeah.
I think once we got into the realm of they have to be empathetic, the player has to have some feeling towards them, which you're not going to get from slugs. Right. Then we start seeing that opportunity there of, like, okay, nobody's going to want to do harm to these girls, or do they? Like, and do we allow them to? It was we weren't comfortable with it at first when it first came up that we could.
I think it was important that it was a way to reflect the sort of larger economic questions of a world like Rapture, where, like, where the economy drives everything. Are there any limits to economic decision making versus moral decision making? Because that's sort of what the Randian notion is, that it's not the role that you don't sort of legislate morality. Let's try to take that to an extreme and see where that ends up. And Little Sisters sort of became that. And in this world, they became a commodity. And the question we have for the players, are you willing, they're a commodity to you as well, potentially. Do you want to participate in the commodification? There was, I think, a fair amount of nervousness internally at the publisher about it for a little while, but pretty quickly they were able to sort of say, look, we trust you guys, and go, do this. And I only had the press, and this sort of happens over and over again. The games press worried a ton about it and wring their hands about it. They ever recognized it was a setting topic, but that it was done to a larger purpose. That it wasn't just sort of like, hey, this is the game where you kill children. And
whatever, and that was a sensitivity. I know that, like, you guys wanted to call them little sisters, not little girls, and it was and it wasn't, it wasn't killing them, it was harvesting them. And I mean, you did some things probably on purpose, right, to sort of explain that this, you weren't doing anything vicious to them, right?
Well, I mean, they do sort of disappear out of you, and a big slug out of their belly, comes up. That we didn't want that to be graphic. We wanted to be very clear that you were killing.
Gruesome. Yeah, right.
Yeah. But it was not intended to be a prurient in terms of, hey, this is a simulation of pulling a sea slug out of a little girl's belly. But we wanted you to understand that you were making a very diabolical moral economic pact there. And we think that came across, and I think it came across well enough. And I think the test of how well it came across is, I think most people didn't really thought of it as am I willing to do this thing or not?
Right.
And people would tell us stories how like their girlfriend saw them harvesting, and then they literally slept on the couch that night.
Right.
And that's that's an interesting. That was interesting how people connected to a 3D mesh that's really no different than any other 3D mesh in the world. Like this little sister, she's not a person. She's a 3D asset, a virtual 3D asset, right? That has a voice actor connected to it who's an adult woman. And nobody was actually getting harmed, but people still emotionally connected to them and made an emotional connection.
And also, I think when you're playing, you don't really know what the impact of that choice is.
Yes.
And that's sort of the curiosity of like, you're a gamer, so it's like, am I going to game the system? Which one should I pick? How does this impact things as you go through the game? It's never really fully clear what that choice is going to lead to, right? And the ambiguousness of that was something you wanted to sort of create mystery around throughout the game?
Yeah, we went back and forth a lot about what the rewards for harvesting versus saving would be, and actually I think we should have really pushed further that the rewards for saving were should have been much more meager than the rewards for harvesting, just to really sort of put you up against the wall, push you up against the wall and say, are you going to stick by your moral guns here? Because you're going to pay for it. Because that's usually the way life is, right? It's always harder to take a moral path than it is to take an amoral path. But there's incentives to take amoral paths because it's the easier path.
As you play through the game, eventually you get to the ending, and as we know now, there were sort of two endings that were affected by that choice. And that was something at the time, I know you said publicly that you weren't in favor of sort of having two endings. Was that in part because, the game is about not having choice, or did you think that, the two endings were, I don't know, like, I'm interested for narratively, like, why you didn't want to go that path?
It seemed forced, given that the game really sort of almost made a joke, a meta commentary joke about the lack of agency in games, the lack of meaning of those choices, given that you have these two endings. I guess you could make an argument that, well, you were free, you were given choice of once Ryan's dead, and that's really what it's about. But I think we also didn't really have enough time to execute on those super well. I was pretty happy with how the happier one came out, with the sort of little sister focus, but it's a much more subtle story than I would have time to tell about your slow descent into, moral chaos and dissolute living and all the things that sort of come along with a life that is sort of separate from a moral structure. It's a long story.
And that's what, you were just switching a cutscene. It wasn't like you were doing sort of a whole other level that was different or something. So the choice was...
There's two cutscenes with very tight time and economic constraints.
Or just start a nuclear war.
Yes. And that's not...
You're a nice guy, or you start a nuclear war.
And because we had so many problems on our plate, that was something I had to sort of do in the spare time. So I was pretty happy with one, but not very happy with the other.
I know you had said publicly before that there was another sort of more ambiguous ending that you had originally planned, or what would you have done?
There was a notion of an ambiguous ending, which if I just wrote one, I would have found a way that would just talk about the moral ambiguity of the world rather than the sort of, positive or negative, because it is such a, look, I think we really tried with BioShock not to sort of make a game about good and evil. It was really about circumstances and what circumstances lead people to. And how they delude themselves with ideology to do things that they would think are evil, but it's okay because it's for the good cause. Right. And that's what I probably would have. If I just had one to write, I'd probably focus more on that. How difficult it is to sort of align when you start being driven by ideology rather than being in the moment and thinking about the impact of what you're doing.
Right. Sean, you talked to gamers, I'm sure, over the years. Did you ever get a sense of how many people harvested versus saved, and was there any sort of data? This is before the days where you get telemetry and data on like what people picked and whatnot.
Yeah, anecdotally, it seems like more people saving little sisters. Although, I have a few friends that are I just harvested every single one. I wanted to see what happened. So I don't know if that was more, the game developer and them trying to see, what would happen, but certainly for the most part, I think most people, which I guess is a good thing. It means that maybe people are good at heart. They kind of feel bad. They want they want to save the little sisters. So, yeah, I'll say it. The needle sways towards the green there.
Time for beddy-bye, Mr. B. Hurry, hurry, Mr. Bubbles.
Nailing the perfect marriage of story to gameplay is a science that many developers still struggle with today. BioShock has left an indelible mark on gaming narrative that can be seen and felt in many modern releases, but Irrational's motto remained from the beginning: don't start with the story, start with the gameplay. A lot of fans probably wonder about the process you go through in writing the story and the design for a game like BioShock. You've talked about how it evolved over time and what eventually ships is very different than your initial vision. Do you guys write like a script or a design document for the game and that becomes sort of the Bible that everyone drives towards, or do you iterate much more?
It's different for every game. Like System Shock 2, I went back to it recently. I wrote a design document, and we started that project in September, and the design document I saw was dated like October or something. So in a month, I wrote the design document, and it didn't change. A lot of it, got expanded upon, but the basic design really didn't change on that. Where on BioShock, I think it evolved in real time much more. We had a pretty substantial design shift, like a year before the ship date.
For BioShock?
BioShock, yeah. It got to be much more about the experience of being in Rapture than about being in your character sheet. And so the game evolved more towards that experiential kind of thing and making sure every idea was expressed in the world as well as just on your character sheet. So before you'd have a lot of things like, I'm doing fire damage or electrical damage, but that was sort of a number flying off ahead versus, the whole notion of there's barrels and you light them on fire and then you can pick them up and throw them.
But you'd have stats coming off characters and all that stuff?
Much more so.
Oh, really?
And that evolved, we did a design shift, but I don't know how well that got documented. I think we were moving so fast that we were just sort of changing things, laying down the tracks as we went right ahead of us. And the same with the screenplay, the screenplay there is no screenplay. It's a bunch of probably Excel files and fragments of Word documents that I'd write, and I'd go to recording sessions and I'd rewrite on the fly once I hear the actor perform. Because once the actor takes on it, you listen to their voice and you say, what you wrote doesn't really matter. What is the right thing for this actor playing this role to be saying? So I tend to do a lot of rewriting in the session. And then you have a bug late at night where somebody says, oh, this doesn't make any sense. And you're like, oh God, and you have to write a new audio log and try to get the actor back in. Or you figure out what's the best way to get this idea across? Yeah. And is it an audio log? Is it a poster on the wall? Is it a piece of text that pops up on the screen? That's always dependent on how much time you have and what actor availability is. So, the plans sort of fall apart. I think we've worked on that a bunch since on the new project we're working on, where we are trying to document things a lot better and keep things a lot more logical, but the train was running so fast on BioShock that we just sort of...
early on, we got the Andrew Ryan scene in, like we'd said before, and that was kind of like the keystone. We're going to put a lot of work into this, so this can't change. Everything that happens before or after that don't really involve a lot of departments working together to make a scene, those things are very malleable, and if you need to change audio logs to represent a story, if you need to add lines or take away lines, that's very doable. And I think for a while we even had text-to-speech.
We even did that, I remember for Infinite with Booker and Elizabeth and all their dialogue, and that really didn't work very well, because you'd have these dramatic scenes, and it'd be like, Elizabeth, we need to go to Comstock, and it just... Yeah. It almost had no value as far as I was concerned.
Atlas radioed on ahead says we're You're looking for an invite to the fisheries. Nuts, I say. But if your head's up to the Wharf Master's office and find old Peach a research camera, maybe I could manage an invite.
Ken has so much of, these games in his head, and you're sort of, you can keep it all straight, or try to, with all the different things and changes. But from the team perspective, Sean, I mean, because this is evolving and Ken's thinking in his head about how this all ties together, how does the team sort of keep up with, what the whole game is going to look like? There's
a lot of specifics that can change. For instance, Atlas used to have a Southern drawl.
Right.
And then, we recast to the Irish.
And we actually cast an actor, wrote the lines, did the whole thing, and realized that people hated that character and distrusted him from the first start. So we had to rewrite him, recast him, redo everything.
Yeah. From a team perspective, you kind of get a sense on which things are going to be really volatile, and that you probably want to push off till later, because if you work on it now, it might change. Larger themes don't tend to change too much, meaning we knew we were in Rapture, we knew we had Big Daddies, we knew we had Little Sisters, we knew we had Splicers, we knew what the arc of the story was about Jack coming into Rapture, and the specifics of this radiolog versus that radiolog didn't really affect anyone outside the audio team at that time, because we could still build the environment. We still knew what the environment was. We still knew what the animations were. There are areas you learn just by working in the same space for a while, that this scene, I'm not touching this yet because I know that it's going to get changed a lot. I think these themes are pretty nailed down, so I'm going to focus the team on getting these things done.
I won't leave you twisting in the wind. We're going to need to draw her out of hiding. But you're going to have to trust me.
The audio logs were, a great part of the game, and something that if you're a true fan, I mean, people really go in and listen to those and piece that all together. But I imagine there's a lot of work that goes into deciding, well, this is better for an audio log versus game dialogue, and there's the act of sort of cutting back and sort of saying, we need to be clear about what the narrative is for the game. What was that process like? I mean, the audio logs, were there things you added at the end, or were those, ideas that you had for the game, but then said, hey, maybe we'd demote these a little bit and make them audio logs?
As Sean was saying, there's sort of a hierarchy of expense that you have to face, and so any ideas you have to get across, especially as you start playing the game, you realize, well, this doesn't make sense, that doesn't make sense. You have to figure out how you can introduce that idea. And generally, as the train is moving, you try to think of cheaper and cheaper ways to get those ideas across. If it's less important, it goes to an audio log. If it's less important, it goes to a poster on the wall.
Well, there's also characters that you can bring in that have audio logs that aren't, Atlas, Tenenbaum, those are your big ones. You can bring in somebody to do a short, a few different audio logs. It's a character that some players may not even find, but
right.
It adds a little bit of depth to Rapture.
And it also, usually each character generally is about a certain idea, and we don't just sort of come up with characters we have an idea problem that we need to solve, and so let's introduce a character who's this guy, and he will be the guy who sort of shepherds you through that idea.
Julie, my dear, I am trying to run a business here. You want to spend time with my honeybees? Well, I'm going to have to start charging you for the pleasure. If I come out one more time and find you lolling out there amongst my hives, I'm grabbing my shotgun. As to your question, yes, my days in beekeeping school are a blur, but I do seem to remember something about that enzyme you keep blabbing on about.
So as you're going through the game and, writing things, rewriting things, were there things with the original BioShock that you've always been surprised that more people didn't pick up on, or was there something that, a connection to a character you thought was really going to resonate with people, which, didn't? Anything like that?
No, it's the opposite. I was amazed, I don't know how you felt, but I was amazed how many people connected to the Would You Kindly stuff. Because I think it was when I wrote that speech, I don't think anybody on the team was like, oh my God, this is really this or that. And I don't think I really had any sense that people were going to connect to it. I think we ended up sort of over time finding more ways to support the notion throughout the game.
Yep.
And I don't think I really, until I heard Pat put together the revelation moment, whereas where you had all the bits that Atlas had said to you in the past building up, and then there was a visual that went along with that. That's when I realized it was going to be a really powerful moment. But even so, I still did I think people were really going to connect to it or really even understand it? Because it's pretty out there. And that it was meta commentary, too. I think that completely, I think I thought oh, it's kind of meta, cool. people connected to it in a much bigger way.
Yeah, the choice and everything, and also just being able to kind of roll back and think of all those other moments throughout the game. And so a great revelation like that, they're few and far between in games where you sort of like, then you want to play it again, you're just like, oh wow, really, that does all make sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a team, we were definitely proud of what we had done. But up till that point, SWAT 4 was the biggest game that we worked on, and we had no expectation of that anybody would pick this up. Or even like BioShock cosplay. I remember the first cosplay I saw with a guy in the Big Daddy suit, and his little daughter was in the kitchen cabinet. I think that was the first one I saw. I was like, what? Whoa, people know this stuff? That's insane.
Yeah, people were building these outfits, and that only expanded with Infinite. I mean, that sort of went crazy with Infinite, with people cosplaying Elizabeth and Luteces and Booker. It meant a lot to people, and I don't think that's something we ever saw coming, and we're deeply grateful for it, because it's one thing to make a game and get good reviews and stuff like that. It's another thing to have things that people are having their weddings themed around it, and their tattoos and naming their children after characters. You can't plan for that, and I think the only way that could happen is if you just make something that you're deeply in love with and passionate about. I can say we were. It was something there's a lot of passion on the team about, but we didn't know people were going to take away what they did.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
Part of the challenge with that, though, is when people love fiction so much and they dive into every word written in every audio log and try and connect all the fiction, make sure it all makes sense. Are there any things from that game that you sort of look back and say, like, oh wow, like we didn't explain this and we should have, or things that fans have misinterpreted over the years?
There are things we think that we did that should have or shouldn't have been in the game. Like I was never a fan of having two endings, and I think
that's what the publisher was asking you to sort of have a.
That was the one thing that 2K, and they were very hands off. That was the one thing they insisted on, and it's not something I really thought was a good idea, because they're still limited, even though they're multiple. They're still limited, and so that was something that we ended up doing. One of the endings was far better than the other one. I mean, there's no. It's clear that I was much more interested in the happier ending with the little sisters than I was with the nuclear submarine ending.
I'm sure part of it was the idea that if this game is, if you're making a choice throughout it, I'm sure when some people are like, oh well, then it has to be a payoff, right?
Right. Except the game was really about lack of choice, not being a choice. So that always struck me as a tension that was weird. But look, at the end of the day, they were putting up a lot of money, and so I can't really complain. They weren't dictatorial at all during the development. So that was the one thing. But that's a game that I wouldn't have put the boss battle in, the final boss battle. Like we seem to end up doing that over and over and over again. Every time we start a project, I'm like, I'm never going to do that again. We're never going to do that again, and we end up doing it.
Right.
We're not good at boss battles, and that you're fighting that guy, and look, this is the naked dude. It just doesn't work.
Totally makes sense.
But and it works really pretty well up till then, but then it doesn't. It just doesn't work. That boss battle's silly.
Rapture is filled corner to corner with detail and history, and the cast of characters that occupy this world are no less dynamic. Every splicer, every level boss has a story. In many ways, these characters are a reflection of their environment, and their environment a reflection of their character.
Let's talk about some of the characters in BioShock. There's so many that fans love, and there are many Wikia pages about them. One thing that I think a lot of fans may not realize is you were telling stories with these characters, a decade ago. And technology today, as we saw in, a game like Infinite, you can do amazing things with facial expressions and storytelling. Conveying that emotion that you did 10 years ago with limited technology was challenging. How hard was it back in the day to sort of, convey story in engine?
We had such a small team that we had to show Tenenbaum or Atlas, they were just splicer models, right?
Yeah,
Oh, really?
Tenenbaum was Ladysmith, which is there's a reason that she's in shadow behind glass, and it's not to be dramatic. It's because we couldn't afford to build another.
Really?
Yeah.
So just something as simple as that, like you couldn't afford to build a
We
model.
didn't have the we
didn't have
we had a few
the
character models in the game. There's
the budget
maybe
or
8
the
or 9
time to build
character
a new
models.
character.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So we're like, oh, we'll put her in silhouette behind a light, and people think it's noir.
And so much of it was driven by the voice performance, I feel like, too,
Yes.
because I mean, that it all had to, it was like a radio play in many ways still.
Yeah, we had some really good actors, and I was able to spend a lot of time with them. And the fact that I could write the stuff, direct it, and then rewrite in the room, and the fact that we had actors who were, for whatever reason, I wasn't even in the same room as them. I was on a speakerphone.
Right.
They were in a studio in New York or LA or something. I don't think I met any of them.
Really? None of the actors in BioShock you ever met in person when you were making the game?
Maybe since, but at the time I hadn't met a single one of them. Except maybe a couple people I played the Circus of Alice thing. Nate Wells played the Jack on the plane. A couple of people in the studio. It was community theater, in terms of the tech and the sort of time we had for it. But the actors were, we had some exceptional actors.
I will say, as doing animation on that game, that you can hide bad animation behind really good audio, and it makes the animation look better. We didn't have a tech animator. It was me. I'd never rigged characters before, and now I'm rigging characters, trying to figure out how, to get all of these characters out to the animation team. So we're very limited when it came to animation tools.
Yeah,
Since apologize to my animators.
No, but you did the big. I mean, for your first game that you rigged the Big Daddy, which is it's not an easy character to rig.
It was, we figured it out, but the tools that we had on Infinite were not the tools that we had on BioShock. So we figured out what we could do and what we could do well, and tried to hide, kind of, put into the darkness the things that we knew we couldn't do very well. And having voice actors of that caliber that can bring those characters to life, you tend to fill in the blanks.
So tell me, friend, which one of the bitches sent you? The KGB wolf or the CIA jackal? Here's the news. Rapture isn't some sunken ship for you to plunder. And Andrew Ryan isn't a giddy socialite who can be slapped around by government muscle.
And you did get to revisit Rapture in the DLC for Infinite, and with today's technology or technology from a few years ago, I'm sure it was liberating for you guys in some ways to be able to use that tech to bring the environment and also characters to life. What was that experience like for you guys to go back and sort of revisit Rapture?
It was liberating because we got to revisit it, but we also, I think when we started, thought we'd be able to go reuse some of the old assets, and they just didn't hold up anymore compared to the Infinite assets. So we basically had to rebuild, not just rebuild everything from scratch, we had to reimagine it from scratch because, we had the ability to make it look grander and bigger, but still feel exactly like Rapture. We're making a different kind of experience than BioShock 1, so it was tricky to make it feel like it was the same kind of game. Because it wasn't, the first one was sort of an action game, the second one was really a stealth game. The Barrel at Sea Part 2 was really a stealth game, and you're really telling the story of Elizabeth throughout those things. Yeah. So it was a different lens, but it was also cool because it allowed me to make the whole story about Elizabeth, to have her be central to the franchise from the very beginning, and she was always, she became the heart of it to me, and to have her, it was really exciting for me to make her, her heroism be something that set the events of BioShock into motion, which eventually, saves all of the little sisters. That was really gratifying, a nice way to tie the whole thing up for me.
And you probably didn't have that idea 10 years ago, right? You had to retrofit it all?
I had no idea.
He has a letter that he's addressed to himself that's 10 years old. Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, for me, it was a nice way for me to say goodbye to BioShock and BioShock Infinite, because, those two worlds together, you don't realize, or I don't think the audience realizes how much time you spend with these characters trying to get them out and polished and into the world. And it was a good opportunity, I think, as a game developer to kind of have that little coda at the end where you're like, okay, I get to, now I'm ready to move on to the next thing. I've had a nice, break. Let's seal this off, and now I'm on to the next thing.
And it was 12 years of our lives, too. Between the very beginning of it, and it was a long time.
Well, I mean, so my daughter, who is 16 now, I did a lot of filming of her when she was 6. as a little sister.
wow.
And this was not mocap, it was just running around the office. And I'm like trying to be like, now trip over the thing and pretend you die. Or like, you know, like trying to like not like traumatize a 6-year-old. Yeah, pretend you're drinking something, and you know, and I never showed her the actual game until much later. But she, on BSI, I put her in a mocap suit and actually used her for the little sister in Paris that's running after the balloon. So that was kind of, for me, like a nice
way to connect it all together. Were there any characters on the original game that you found hardest to write? I mean, you mentioned like, you know, recasting Atlas, things like that, but was there a character that was the most challenging for you, Ken?
Well, Atlas, because, you know, he was basically written completely twice. That was very, very tough. And I was very happy about the original character, and I thought I'd really done something great. And then we showed it to people, and they just hated it, and they didn't trust him. And if they didn't trust him, we were screwed.
All falls apart, yeah.
And so it was tough, because we, after having gone through all the recordings, actually, I had to let the actor go. It's no fault of his own, right? It was on us. He had invested in it, tell him that it wasn't going to happen, and rewrite it from scratch. That was hard, and that was tough. And then after I finished it, I had a debate with somebody on the team who felt the accent was really, really phony. And we had an English person on the team, and he felt the accent was really phony. So at the last minute, we basically ended up doing a focus test in Ireland.
Wow.
To see if people bought the accent, because the actor playing Atlas was Irish, but he was from a different part of Ireland, so he was playing a different kind of Irish accent. Right. I don't think he was from Dublin, and Atlas sort of had a Dublin accent. And so at the last minute, I thought I was going to have to do it again.
Oh, wow.
And fortunately, the focus test came back, and people loved it.
I don't know how you survived that plane crash, but I've never been one to question Providence. I'm Atlas, and I aim to keep you alive.
And a lot of the villains in the game felt like they were, you know, very much tied to certain levels. And this was, you know, you were still in an environment of levels with BioShock, right? It wasn't just a big open world. Did that all sort of get designed together? It's like, here's the best villain that's going to fit to this environment and this theme of, you know, this area?
Some of them work better than others. I mean, I think obviously Steinman and especially Sandra Cohen really, I think, dominate in terms of the level boss.
They are their levels.
They are the levels. And some of the characters didn't hold up as well, I don't think, on the writing side. The fun thing about the characters at work, like Simon, where he had all those little displays with the scissors and the tech, you know, that was stuff the art team came up with to support that character. And obviously Sandra Cohen, in that level, you know, I had this idea for this character, and, you know, as this artist, and taking Andrew Ryan's thinking to the extreme, you know, through a lens of art, was really fun. They were really, I mean, in a lot of ways, they're sort of like more like Batman villains than they are like actual, you know, real world villains. That they all have, you know, the Joker cares far more about the humor and the dark humor that he has, and the Riddler cares more about the riddles than he actually does about money. You know,
right.
The money, the crime is this afterthought. Right. It's the philosophy. And so these characters have a lot in common with, and there's probably a lot of inspiration taken from sort of characters like the Joker in terms of a guy like any of the characters in BioShock, because they were really driven by their ideology, but their ideology is a mask for their sense of selves, right? You know, this stuff is really, Cohen knows he's a hack, and he doesn't want to, you know, he can't admit that to himself, so he has to wrap himself in all this nonsense, because the last thing he could ever do is look in the mirror and say, I'm not much of an artist.
No need to thank me for jamming the transmissions of those boors, Atlas and Ryan. Let them have their squabble. The artist, yes, the artist knows there is richer earth to till.